Almost everyone, even those who are not into true crime, can probably give you at least a couple of examples of serial killers that have never been caught. Most people have heard of Jack the Ripper. In 1888, he murdered at least 5 women in London's poor Whitechapel district. But did you know that the equivalent of Jack the Ripper was prowling around the South in the United States about 100 years ago? It's very likely that you've never heard this story. The murderer took advantage of the racism and segregation present in those years, spreading fear among African American women. He was even petty enough to tell one woman that she was not attractive enough to be killed by him. His audacity grew gradually as authorities ignored his crimes for the most part, probably due to his choice of victims. The Ripper killed around 20 young and beautiful women in the streets of Atlanta, mysteriously emerging from and then disappearing back into the fog.
Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. My name is Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for joining today. And let's just go ahead and address this right at the beginning. Yes, I sound different. I've got a grizzly bear living in the back of my throat, and he's made a home back there, scratching and clawing, and that's what it sounds like anyway. I'm not operating at 100%, and that's why you only had one episode last week. I wasn't feeling very well. And I feel a lot better now. Still not at 100%, but we're going to give it a go. And please try to ignore the fact that I sound this way. The alternative was to just keep not doing episodes until I sounded normal again, but who knows when that's going to happen. I spent the last couple of days on the couch under a blanket and watching different TV shows and movies and stuff like that. And speaking of, I'm 100% sure you've heard of this if you have Netflix, but The Adam Project on Netflix is fantastic. It's great. If you haven't watched it, you should do that. But let me prepare you for something. I'm not going to spoil anything, but you're going to cry. So grab tissues ahead of time. It's a very good movie. Okay, if you are new to this podcast, this is the first time you're listening, welcome. Glad you're here. Make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss any future episodes of 10-Minute Murder. In the show notes of this episode, you'll find links to where you can connect with 10-Minute Murder, the podcast, on all the social media apps. Also an email address if you would like to contact me directly via email, 10minutemurder@gmail.com. That's all located in the show notes of this episode. Now, let's get to today's story. As Atlanta recovered from the Civil War, a brand new terror emerged from the ashes to terrorize the city. Each of the killer's murders took place on a Saturday night, and for one horrific spring in 1911, a new body was discovered every Sunday morning. Some people go out on the weekends to do fun activities like grabbing a beer with their friends and watching a game, but this man went out on a completely different mission: to find and kill innocent women. What distinguishes the Atlanta Ripper from Jack the Ripper is killing not prostitutes, but well-dressed and neat working women, with many of them having received an education. From the testimony of one of the victims who survived the attack, we know that the perpetrator killed within his own ethnic group. And this is so common that when the Night Stalker Richard Ramirez was attacking random victims of various ethnicities and ages without paying attention to gender, he was not caught as quickly as he could have been, because according to the criminal profilers, serial killers most likely tend to kill within their own racial or ethnic groups. One of the early victims of the Atlanta Ripper managed to survive and got a glimpse of her assailant as he fled. Emma Lou Sharp revealed that the Atlanta Ripper was black, which surprised many. She testified that the attacker was tall, dark, broad-shouldered, wearing a broad-brimmed black hat. And if you'll remember when it was revealed that the DC sniper was really 2 black males, a commenter in the Harlem Times expressed shock and amazement, claiming that, quote, "White folks have pretty well cornered the market on mass killings and serial killings." And he was right. The fact that most of the murders are men does not surprise anyone, but when it comes to race, white killers dominate. According to the FBI, 58% of all American predators are white. a fact that you can find all over Hollywood movies like Silence of the Lambs. The stereotypical white serial killer is perpetuated. And those statistics haven't really changed over the years, and this is probably why the testimony that revealed that the Atlanta Ripper to be African American might be surprising, or at least unexpected. The Atlanta Ripper's first victim was Rosa Trice, a 35-year-old housewife who was murdered in 1911. Her body was found near her home with her throat slashed from ear to ear and her head crushed in. The cut was so deep that her head was almost severed from her body, and the body of a second nameless victim was found in the same condition. The Ripper continued to kill, and the list of his victims continued to grow with more names like Belle Walker, Lena Sharp, and Sadie Holly. Coming back to the topic of Emmylou Sharp, Emma panicked because her mother had not come back from the local market she had gone to. She was frantically searching for her. While exploring and looking for her, she met a man who blocked her way and said, quote, "Don't be afraid. I never hurt girls like you," insinuating that she was not pretty enough. Then he laughed, and as she started to run away, he stabbed her in the back. As she ran crying out, a group of alarmed men began to scour the dark alleys and found the body of her dead, almost decapitated mother. Unfortunately, the description of the attack, which she was able to provide, did not help, and the killer continued to claim more lives, remaining an uncatchable criminal. Atlanta was paralyzed by an atmosphere of fear. Black women had to watch their back at every turn. The Ripper always struck under the cover of night, emerging from the mist on the deserted side of streets. He attacked women returning to their homes to rest after a long day of work. One of the women, Mary Yadell, heard a whistling coming from the dark alley she was heading to after leaving her employer's mansion. Suddenly, a tall, dark-skinned man was walking toward her from around the corner. Mary sprinted back to her employer's house, who quickly ran to the indicated alley with a revolver in his hand, almost catching the Ripper. But he had disappeared into thin air. Sadly, this case did not interest the investigators at first, as it involved black women. White-owned newspapers only began reporting the horrific murders of the women in the African-American community after the murder of Belle Walker. As rumors spread, Atlanta's black community became even more frightened. The Baltimore Sun wrote an article that reported the killings resulted in black service workers refusing to go to work after dark. It was only when the number of the dead and the frequency of the crime began to rise shockingly that the police took serious action. The passivity of the authorities gave the murderer a free field to show off. The butcher became more and more ruthless, increasing the brutality of each attack. When Mary Putnam's body was discovered, not only was her throat cut, but also her breast was slashed and her heart had been ripped and left lying in the dirt next to her. Another victim's head was beaten so badly that her facial features were unrecognizable. Strangely, the Ripper was probably a feet lover, as he was fixated on shoes, sometimes taking them with him. Maybe he considered these trophies, a detail that we will probably never have a conclusive answer on. The standard MO of the Ripper was to surprise the victim with an attack from behind, grab the head, cut the throat quickly with a knife or razor, and mutilate the corpse. Some researchers indicate that it was not necessarily one killer, but a group of killers coordinating with each other, or a group of different criminals who did not know each other but targeted the same victims. In my opinion, according to research, the most likely perpetrator of the attacks may have been 35-year-old Todd Henderson, who was ultimately exonerated. He was identified by Emmylou Sharp and was seen with Sadie Holly during the night of her death. His shoe prints matched those found at the crime scene, and in the morning after Sadie died, he carried a razor to the barber in order to sharpen his blade, which had become dull. When decades later, between 1979 and 1981, the Atlanta child killer was on the loose, killing at least 28 African-American children, adolescents, and adults, it was believed by some that this might be the work of the same serial killer. After Wayne Williams was charged with 2 of those crimes and the murders stopped immediately, some people thought that the Atlanta Ripper case could be solved as well, even though the described slayings that I mentioned before of the Atlanta Ripper were between 1911 and 1915. Despite Georgia being afflicted by race-related violence and segregation, communities worked together across the divide to solve the mystery. And even though they arrested 6 suspects, the identity of the killer was never actually discovered. For 4 years, an unknown killer, or, as some put it, killers, stalked the midnight streets of Atlanta, preying on young African-American women. As the community was gripped by terror and the authorities remained inactive, the list of victims increased. The Atlanta Ripper is believed to have killed at least 20 women. Today, the case remains just as mysterious as it was during the 1900s. That's today's 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. Thanks for joining today, and thank you for ignoring the way I sound today. I appreciate it. If you are brand new to this podcast, like I mentioned at the beginning, be sure before you go to subscribe so that you don't miss any future episodes of 10-Minute Murder. Connect with 10-Minute Murder on social media. All the links are in the show notes of this episode. If you have friends, congratulations. If you think that they might be into brief true crime stories like this one, please let them know about 10-Minute Murder. Thank you for listening. Be safe and make good choices.